Chapter 24, Forest Service, Agency in Transition. The history of the Forest Service can be simplified into two fundamental stages: the Custodial Era, 1905 to 1942, and the Commodity Production Era, 1942 to present. At the time of its founding in 1905, the Forest Service had a legacy of timber sales, but they were minor in scale because private lands were logged off first to meet the national market needs for lumber. By the 1920s, however, a soaring economy led to a record peak of national forest timber sales of 1.65 billion board feet in 1930. The Great Depression shrunk harvest for a decade, then a new peak was reached of 1.78 billion in 1940. This was quickly topped as wartime defense needs stimulated harvest off national forests. The 1942 level was 2.2 billion board feet. Yet, even then, only 2% of the national supply of timber came from the national forests. The post-war demographic and economic surge accelerated demand for housing and gave the agency the opportunity to expand national forest timber harvests. This it did with zest, moving from a level of 3 billion board feet in 1950 to 9 billion board feet in 1960. These were years of growth in employment in the agency that started with about 500 permanent personnel in 1905. It reached 1,800 by 1920, increasing to 5,700 by 1930, 7,484 by 1949. Even larger increases took place in the post-war period, with the number of employees reaching 21,953 by 1979 and a total of 32,375 by 1990. Agency foresters predicted that the demand for saw timber would continue and that by the year 2000, the national forest would need to produce 20 billion board feet. Instead, volume peaked in 1987 with an all-time record high of 12.7 billion and dropped to 12 billion in 1989, which was 13% of the wood harvested in the nation. The massive road building and timber sales during the post-war stage of Forest Service history signified a major change in agency image that not all of the public accepted. The ranger on horseback who patrolled the forest for fire prevention gave way to the road construction inspector and timber sale administrator wearing a hard hat and driving a green pickup. Local citizens, usually active recreationalists, were first to protest specific projects that would alter the environment in ways they didn't like. In time, local concerns over herbicide use, timber harvest levels, and so on became national issues, much to the dismay of timber-dependent communities and ranchers who grazed their animals on national forests and grasslands. National environmental groups are seeking to reduce timber harvest levels and livestock numbers on national forests and grasslands. After generations of earning a living by logging and ranching on public lands, residents of rural areas find their way of life challenged by urban outsiders, and many of them find these changes threatening. Inside the Forest Service, the same debate echoes, with often younger or at least newer employees with non-traditional backgrounds and professions, biologists, archaeologists, and other ologists, argue for a return to the custodial mode or more environmentally sensitive management. Meanwhile, employees who entered the agency as foresters during the heyday of the development era responded that the nation needs jobs and goods provided by commodity production on national forests and grasslands. At this moment, the explosive issue of the ultimate mission of the Forest Service is in the political arena, where it will ultimately be decided by Congress. A key to the issue is appropriations, because funding levels shape the amount of attention that the agency can devote to the mix of resources it manages. As an example of the boom years, from 1954 to 1970, the Forest Service received 66% of the budget increases it requested for timber sales administration, but only 20% of its requested increases for recreation and wildlife. 17% went for reforestation, and 15% for soil and water management. In the meantime, the workforce gropes one day at a time toward another as yet unknown stage of land management. In addition, the agency must adapt to other social changes, including the entry of non-whites and women into the agency in numbers matching their profile in the civilian labor force. This internal change accelerated following the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s, which resulted in equal employment opportunity laws and programs in government agencies. The Forest Service has also been involved with the Job Corps program since 1964, which has brought in many new employees with different skills, such as teachers and counselors. Yet, in the 1990s, there is still a need for an active recruitment and retention effort given the low numbers of women and members of minority groups even as late as 1983, when of the 5,700 professional foresters in the Forest Service, only 450 were women. Geraldine B. Larson became the first female forest supervisor in 1985. To understand the cause of a shift in the Forest Service to a new stage of land stewardship, an analysis must start with the watershed decade of the 1970s. The first signal of change was the confrontation between industry and environmentalists that ended with the passage of the Wilderness Act of 1964. The Forest Service had hoped to preempt the dispute by getting Congress to pass the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act in 1960. The Act, Mixed Uses, Resources, and Lands, in a list of 5 purposes of the National Forest: outdoor recreation, range, timber, watershed, and wildlife and fish. 2 key points of the law are that no resource has statutory priority, and each is to receive equal consideration in determining the best combination of uses. The problem was who was to decide the mix and on what basis. The 1964 law allowed Congress to establish wilderness areas on national forests and was only the beginning of public and congressional involvement in Forest Service management practices. The 10-year study on roadless area reviews and evaluations stemmed from the compliance work required by the Wilderness Act. Public involvement in agency policy was fostered in part by a law with unintended consequences that was signed by President Richard M. Nixon on January 1, 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act. The agency had always consulted with special interest groups, but after the National Environmental Policy Act, Congress and the public became directly involved in daily operations of the Forest Service. The Act allowed lawsuits to be filed against the agency for non-compliance with the requirements to prepare environmental impact statements on proposed major actions by federal agencies. The first important timber management challenge took place in 1969 on the Bitterroot National Forest. Later, in 1973, the Forest Service practice of clear-cutting on the Monongahela National Forest was challenged in court. The public no longer held the view that the professional forester knows best how to manage the national forests. Outsiders were now going to monitor agency activities, and there were several additional laws that helped ensure that the public had a say in land use management practices. The first law with teeth was the 1973 Endangered Species Act. The next law, the 1974 Forest and Rangeland Renewable Resource Planning Act, or RPA, requires inventory of resources aimed towards sustainable renewable resource production. The 1976 National Forest Management Act replaced and clarified the original Organic Act of 1897 and requires that the Forest Service involve the public more in its decision-making and hire people trained in disciplines other than forestry and engineering. As late as 1960, 90% of professional positions in the Forest Service were filled with foresters. Any attempt to summarize the last 3 decades of agency history is doomed to be incomplete. The service-wide adoption of the Data General Computer System by 1984 reinforced the trend toward greater agency centralization and forced more managers to do their own typing. The fostering of diversity of people and occupations is a story still in progress. Conflict continues in the present. Lawsuits over the northern spotted owl and old-growth forests in the Pacific Northwest are having a major impact on agency practices. Herbicide use was a major issue only a few years ago, with range and salmon on the horizon as the next 2 resources in the environmental spotlight. What may be a final observation of the move to a new era is that never again will the agency operate without checking the public pulse, because perception and beliefs are stronger arguments than scientific ones alone. The 1990 RPA publication points out the new direction of our transition with its goal of more balance among the resources.